Hey guys, Christy here. It's time for A Different Atheist Reads, and today we're going to be dealing with the second section of chapter 2, and I'm going to have to remember in the last video when I said I was hoping I would be able to engage more with the content and not do the summarizing? Yeah, not so much. But I have a plan, and I hope this is going to work out really well in terms of getting through the material and setting us up to a point where we can actually start to engage with it. So let's try it out. So what I've planned out is to break the section up into two different videos. In the first video, I want to give you the overview of the whole two sections that we're going to be covering. Then I'm going to discuss Deuteronomy, as per Karen's A History of God, and Jeremiah in her A History of God. After that, I think it's going to be enough for one video, so I'll do a thank you, and I have a recommendation. If you like this book series and you're interested in other ones, I have a recommendation to give you, and I'll also explain a little bit about the video links underneath the video and the playlist that I've created. So all of that I'll cover in this video. In the next video, we're going to kind of race through what I think is a lot, but connect back to what we set up in this video. So we're going to be changing our focus a little bit. We're going to be looking at Ezekiel, who's part of the priestly school, then 2nd Isaiah, and then the priestly texts together. And then in Karen's book, she provides a little bit of a comparison of the outlook of the authors of the Deuteronomy school and the priestly school. So there's a bit of a comparison. Then she does a little bit about Job. At the end, she sort of chucks in a paragraph or two about Job, and then transitions into the influence of Greek philosophy onto Jewish thought. It seemed to make sense to stop at Job, even though Job is a bit of a dangler, but he seems to be more logically a fit with the authors of the text rather than sticking him into philosophy. So that's how I've worked out this next section. That runs just, if you're using the Kindle edition, we're going to be covering pages 65 through 82. And in this video, we're pretty much just going to be covering 65 through about 72. All right, so that's where we're going in the next two videos. Let's get started. If you remember back from the last video, I complained about how lost I was. And there is a lot of sort of assumed knowledge in Karen's book, or she doesn't touch on things a lot. So in terms of the timeline, I just want to give you an overview, because again, the books of the Hebrew Bible aren't in chronological order. And actually, it looks like from the timeline, Karen's not going in chronological order either, so I've had to revise my opinion on the way she organized the book from the last video. And I think now she's organized Deuteronomy and Jeremiah together because the content is similar, and then she pushes more of the priestly influences into the next section. But as you'll see, it looks like the priestly school started to write before Deuteronomy, so I'm still really super lost. But in the interest of structure, let's look at this timeline. So from circa 900 BCE, according to the documentary hypothesis, that's when the J source was written. Then around 800 BCE, we get the emergence of the E source, which is characterized by the use of Elohim rather than Yahweh. In 690 or so, that's when the P, or the priestly sources, started to emerge. And then we see the relevant section for this book, talking about the reforms of King Josiah, the rise of Jeremiah. That happens between sort of 649 and, well, you got King Josiah then to 609, and you've got Jeremiah writing from between 626 BCE or around there to around 587. After this, well, during this time period, or just just after it, or whatever, we've got 620 BCE. That's when, according to the documentary hypothesis, the D source is written. But again, it's not so much that this is one person writing at a particular time, rather it's a school of thought. So the Deuteronomy school of thought also includes Joshua, Judges, Samuel 1 and 2, Kings 1 and 2, and these are all considered part of the Deuteronomic influenced texts. According to the final timeline here in the documentary hypothesis, around 450 BCE was when the 5 books were created from these four independent sources. So we are in that King Josiah, Jeremiah exile time, where we have not just Deuteronomic texts, the Deuteronomy authors coming up, but we also have the priestly school that's been writing and has its own similar worldview, but different concerns, as it were. And this will come out more in the next video, but also from the lectures from Christine Hayes's Hebrew Bible, a Yale lecture, which again is so incredibly valuable. I really do recommend you watch them as you go along, because you'll get a lot more out of this book series from watching her content than from reading A History of God. So I think we do need to take into account this idea that the people who are writing, the men whose writings we are reading, have a political agenda, have a social agenda, have one that unifies their religious authority with the political authority in order to force people to do what they want. They want people, of course, to believe on their own and have faith, but they are not above using the power of the state to enforce things like destroying high places and centralizing worship, as we'll see shortly in Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is one of the sources that's identified as an independent source, and that is to say it's not merely copying from the J source or the E source. It's an original source of information and values and views. It is seen not so much by scholars as the work of a single person, as much as a school of thought, and it's not quite as organized as like when we think of a faculty or a school, so much as a bunch of people who agreed pick up texts with other people that they agreed to, and they copy them and pass them along and add notes. And so it's more like just a collection of people whose views through time can be correlated or put together as having similar characteristics. Other books that are considered within the Deuteronomistic history is Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And as I mentioned, the book of Jeremiah is also considered part of the D source material. The last thing is that it was written during the 6th century, during the Babylonian exile. And there's also been some editorial reworking of both what's called the Tetrateuch, and I'll put a little description of what that is here, and Jeremiah. So we see some editorial work going on. This is the D source material. The story goes that Josiah was having extensive repairs done in the temple. The workmen who were there found this ancient manuscript, and they read it out, and it was purportedly Moses' last sermon to the children of Israel. And in that discovered sermon that nobody remembered ever happened, Moses centralizes the worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem. So before this, people and local priests, when they would have an animal, they would have an altar, they would sacrifice the animal to Yahweh, drain the blood of it, and then consume it. Or there would be worship of Yahweh that could be done outside of Jerusalem. So you'd have local priests who would perform these ceremonies, and everyone coexisted. There were high places where people could sacrifice to Yahweh or other gods, and they could do it in their local communities. Josiah put an end to all of that and basically had all of that stuff destroyed, and the only place where people could make sacrifices would now be in the temple. So this book of the law, which is referred to, is what scholars think was probably the core of Deuteronomy as we have it today. It also includes a very new value of intransigence that reflects this new 7th century perspective of increased competition, increased single focus on Yahwehism, and the rejection of worshiping any other gods as idolatrous. Moses is made to give new centrality to the covenant in his discovered speech. And there's also the notion of the special election of Israel, that Yahweh had marked out his people from all other nations, not because of their merit, but because of his great love. In return, he demanded complete loyalty and a fierce rejection of all gods. This is quoting from Armstrong on page 66. She then discusses a little bit of the notion of election, the idea that God had set Israel apart from the Goyim, and then she has this phrase, the author makes Moses say, when they arrive in the promised land, they were to have no dealings whatsoever with the native inhabitants. They must make no covenant with them or show them any pity. There must be no intermarriage, no social mixing, and above all, they were to wipe out the Canaanite religion. She quotes, tear down their altars, smash their standing stones, cut down their sacred poles, and set fire to their idols, Moses commanded the Israelites. For you are a people consecrated to Yahweh, your Elohim. It is you that Yahweh, our Elohim, has chosen to be his very own people out of all of the peoples in the earth. She then talks a bit about criticism of the notion of election in her chapter, and then also there's this curious thing that Christine Hayes points to as well in one of her lectures, but this idea of both promises and threats. So Yahweh, unlike other laws given in the time, it's always, if you do this wrong, here will you be your punishment. But because the laws of the time for Israel were written by God, they didn't come from a king, they came from God, they also include blessings. So you get this sort of, if you do what I tell you and you obey my laws, you will have rich, wonderful blessings. And if you violate the covenant, if you don't keep my laws, then I'm going to punish you. So this is kind of a weird notion that there still seems to exist a little bit today. It's the basis of the prosperity gospel, right? God wants you to be prosperous and to have a lot of things and to live in a land of milk and honey, and all you have to do to get all of these material benefits is to do exactly what I say. And if you don't do exactly what I say, instead of having the wonderful benefits, you're going to get punishment. So this is basically where this the system is established. We're getting this linking between the cursings and the blessings, and the curses are linked to idolatry and the worship of other gods. Having discovered this ancient writing that nobody remembered, Josiah set about on destroying everything that wasn't Yahwehist. So everything that wasn't about Yahweh was taken out of the temple. The local places for the pagan gods, the high places, were all destroyed. Any images were destroyed. And also for those followers of Yahweh who were previously allowed to do sacrifices and rituals in their local areas, now the priests were only allowed to offer sacrifices to Yahweh in the purified temple of Jerusalem. Karen doesn't talk about it, but it does make sense in light of the political religious situation that was going on. That included the collapse of the northern kingdom, the disappearance of the 12 tribes, many refugees streaming in, Judah becoming a vassal of the Assyrian state, and pagan influences now coming into this area. By making the cult of Yahweh the only thing that would be practiced in Jerusalem and the areas where it controlled, it was a bit of a sort of a rallying around the flag thing. It set apart the Israelites from their overlords, and it gave them a sense of identity. So we can see this as, really a huge amount of religious intolerance. I think you can also see it as a form of patriotic zeal, and trying to do a little bit of us versus them rather than being too assimilated into the wider pagan culture that they were being surrounded and occupied by. They didn't just reform the physical structures around them and the temples, they also rewrote history. They went to the historical books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings and revised them according to their new ideology. Later, there were passages added that gave more of the Deuteronomy interpretation of the Exodus myth, added and tacked on to the older narratives of J and E. So we see that it is not the case that the Bible was written down and it was sacrosanct and not manipulated. We see that the people who were writing at the time felt very much like they could update it. They could revise their views, revise their previous teachings of God to reflect a new reality. And Karen does, again in this chapter, say something to that effect, but she focuses on it being sort of logically or scientifically sound. I think Christine Hayes has a much better approach to this, which is it didn't occur to them that the books that they were using were somehow untouchable. They saw it as a living tradition that they were able to adapt. And I think that that's a little more plausible than to just say whatever worked for them. It's not just about what works, it's also about maintaining that history and making adjustments. And we see that happen also with the priestly text, so we'll get on with that. Another consequence of this that Karen points out, this new exclusivism, is that there was now basically this Yahweh becomes a god of with a holy war of extermination. Israelites are told that the native Canaanites must not live in their country, and this is a policy which Joshua is going to implement with unholy thoroughness, she says, and then moves on to this diversion about the dangers of election. And she has about a page and a half or so where she discusses election. She critiques it a bit more in depth. She set it up before, but she goes into it a bit more here. She also says, and again, this is one of Karen's views that I don't know where she gets it from, but she talks about a personal God like Yahweh can be manipulated to shore up the beleaguered self in this way. An impersonal deity like Brahman cannot. So I think here what she's trying to point to is that the history of Yahweh is one in which his followers have imputed their emotional feelings on him, and that it's a little bit of a mirror that people use rather than making God like the unmoved mover, or as she describes it, impersonal deity like Brahma. Yahweh seems to be very bound up in the egos of the authors, the egos of the men who are writing these texts. She doesn't say that. I'll say that. But the implication here, I think, is that she's again discussing this sort of way that men are writing God in such a way that he seems more human, that he is more like them. Having done a little bit on Deuteronomy, she then moves on to Jeremiah. And just as by way of a little bit of background, Jeremiah is very complex poetic Hebrew. It has come down actually in two distinct versions. There's a Hebrew version that has one sort of form to it, and then there's also a Greek translation. And I think Christine Hayes mentions in her lecture on this that there's even parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls that are different from the Hebrew version that we have, or the Greek one. So it seems like Jeremiah is not a fixed text at all. There was a lot of editing, a lot of additions, and a lot of moving of the passages even. It was quite a fluid document for a while. What are the main themes of Jeremiah? Well, in Jeremiah, we have that whole, whether it's raining or it's not, God is doing it. God now is, instead of defending the people of Israel, he's using Babylon as an instrument to punish Israel. Jeremiah in his writings also discusses the emotional torment he felt being called to be a prophet of God. That, Karen writes, Yahweh was experienced as an external transcendent reality. He needed to be humanized in some way to make him less alien. This is very Karen. I don't, again, there's no really reference for this or what any of that really means, what alien means, any of that, so I'm just going to move along. Jeremiah continues with this tradition of ascribing human emotions to Yahweh, and that he makes God lament his own homelessness, affliction, and desolation. And finally, Karen writes that God is dependent upon men when he wants to act in the world, an idea that would become very important in Jewish conceptions of the divine. Alright, I think that's going to be enough content for this video. So to end this first part of section 1, I want to, before I end, say first thank you to Gary Edwards and his channel. He's a person who I support on Patreon and have been following and learning from his content for a really long time. Very nicely did me a little shout out, and as a consequence I have had a lot of his viewers come over and participate on my channel. Welcome to everyone who came over from Gary's channel. The comments that people have made when they say, oh, I saw it, your recommendation, and I came over and I like your stuff, the comments that you guys give in terms of the content are it's always great stuff. So thank you so much for coming over, and I'm really glad that you're enjoying my content. If you like this book series and you're wondering if there's anything else out there like it, there is. I can certainly recommend Harry Ray's book that he's doing, a sort of similar thing to what I'm doing with a History of God, informed by, like the Steve Shives format. And that is God a Delusion by Eric Wrighton. He's, I think, about two sections in. He did a preview and then an introduction in the first part. I really like his stuff, and his book is way better organized than mine. Oh my gosh. His stuff is, the guy he's arguing against has got, his downsides, but at least he's clear and he's articulate, and so I really would recommend that, and you can check it out. I'll put a link in the D box below. I also just finally want to say that if you have missed a video that I've used in the series, or you want to remind yourself of some content, I do have a playlist called A History of God on my channel, and on that I put the videos that I have cited in every single video across the series, so that you can go back and catch up, remind yourself of things, or even find videos that you didn't know were on there. And the last thing that I want to say is, in preparation for you watching the accompanying lecture series from Christine Hayes' Yale course, would be that the first one is going to be on Deuteronomy, because that's what Karen takes up first. The second one is about Jeremiah, but when I went to the Jeremiah lecture, she had actually started covering the content about Jeremiah in the previous lecture. So you're going to see lecture 18, and it's not going to say Jeremiah on it, but if you skip to about minute 25, that is where her discussion of Jeremiah starts. And the bulk of it, that stuff that's relevant for the book and the background, you can get by just watching from the 25-minute mark on. So just as an FYI. Other than that, until next Thursday, I've been Christy, you've been awesome, and thanks so much for watching. Bye. Something that would set the Israelites apart from them. I think a little bit of dust on from my cookie. So yeah.